He noticed a strange window in the cliff and had no idea that behind it was an abandoned house, hiding a secret that shocked everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part, and tell us in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The village lay pressed against the mountains, like something forgotten in a pocket, wedged between steep gray slopes and a narrow road that winter erased for months at a time. At more than 1,000 meters above sea level, the air had a different weight, thinner and colder, cutting into the lungs even in summer, while in winter it became a living thing that crept into walls and bones alike. The peaks rose around the settlement in a broken circle, their ridges scarred by old cuts where miners once clawed ore from the stone, and when clouds sank low, the entire valley drowned in white, as if the mountains themselves were trying to bury what remained of the place. Once, the village had been a hive of movement. Rusted rails still ran from the sealed mine entrance down toward the river, vanishing beneath weeds and fallen rocks. A line of empty dormitory buildings leaned toward one another like exhausted men, their windows dark, their stairwells filled with snowdrifts that never fully melted. The old club, where dances and meetings had been held, stood with a collapsed roof and a faded mural of smiling workers peeling from the wall. Near the main square, now nothing more than cracked asphalt with grass pushing through, a playground lay abandoned, its swings tangled in wire, its slide bent and streaked with rust. These were not ruins from some distant century, but the remains of a life that had ended only a few decades ago, leaving behind a landscape that felt haunted not by ghosts, but by unfinished stories. In this place lived a man who had learned to survive without expecting mercy. His house was a narrow structure of stone and warped boards that leaned slightly downhill, as if it too wanted to slide away from the mountain that loomed above it. The walls had been patched with whatever he could find, insulation torn from abandoned buildings, old cardboard pressed into cracks, fabric stuffed into holes where the wind screamed through. In winter, he sealed one room off entirely and lived in the kitchen, sleeping near the stove, waking every few hours to feed it with wood he gathered himself. There was no running water inside, only buckets that he filled from a communal tap that froze so often he sometimes had to melt snow instead. Electricity arrived when the line was not down, which in the worst months meant perhaps a few hours a day, if that. His days were shaped by work that was barely work at all. He carried scrap metal from the slopes, pieces of rail, broken machinery, scraps of pipe he pried loose from the remains of old buildings, loading them onto a battered handcart and pushing it for kilometers down to a trader who paid him by weight. On other days, he repaired fences, patched roofs, carried sacks of grain or coal for neighbors who did not want to climb the hills themselves. It was never enough to change his life, only enough to let him keep breathing inside it. The money went immediately to food, kerosene, sometimes a sack of potatoes or flour when he could afford it. He learned to stretch meals, to drink tea that was mostly hot water and memory, to make a loaf last 3 days instead of 1. What the village gave him most consistently was not help, but attention of a certain kind. People looked at him longer than they looked at others, not with curiosity, but with a measuring gaze that asked how a man like him had ended up here and whether he belonged. Whispers followed him when he passed through the square, comments dropped like pebbles behind his back. The suggestion that he was strange, that he spent too much time alone in the mountains, that he was not quite like everyone else. It was never said directly, never loud enough to force a confrontation, but the message seeped into his bones all the same. He felt it in the way conversations paused when he approached and resumed when he had passed, in the way people spoke about him as if he were not there even when he stood a few steps away. The mountains were the one place where those eyes could not follow him. From childhood he had learned their paths, not the tourist trails marked on maps, but the thin lines of habit worn by goats and hunters, the ledges where the rock widened just enough for a boot, the places where you could rest without fearing that the stone beneath you would suddenly crumble. When he walked there, he felt a kind of quiet that did not exist in the village, a silence that was not empty, but filled with wind, distant bird calls, the low groan of the mountain settling against itself. Up there he was not watched. Up there he was simply a man moving through a landscape that did not care who he was. He had been climbing since early morning when it happened. The day was clear but cold, the sky a pale blue that looked fragile, as if it might shatter if touched. He was following a familiar route along the slope above the old mine road, scanning the ground for anything of value, when a sudden flash caught his eye. It was not bright like metal, but soft, almost like the reflection from a mirror hidden behind fog. He stopped, unsure at first whether he had imagined it, then took a few cautious steps back until the angle of the sun shifted. There it was again, a pale rectangle set into the sheer face of the cliff, so perfectly shaped that his breath caught. He stood for a long time, squinting, trying to tell himself it was nothing, a trick of light on a patch of lighter stone, perhaps a slab exposed by erosion. Yet, the longer he stared, the more the shape resolved itself, four straight edges that did not belong to nature, the faint suggestion of a frame. The mountain had always been rough here, jagged, pocked by cracks and dark streaks of mineral. This was different. This was clean. He went home with that image burning in his mind. That night, he lay awake on his narrow bed, listening to the stove creak as it cooled, seeing the rectangle again and again whenever he closed his eyes. In the morning, he climbed back to the same spot, heart beating faster with each step. The light was different now, the sun higher, but when he reached the overlook he found it again, that same improbable window set into solid rock, unchanged by the shift in day. Over the following days he returned at different hours, sometimes early, sometimes late, watching how the light touched it. At noon it seemed dull, almost invisible, but in the morning and toward evening it caught the sun and shone faintly, as if it were made of glass rather than stone. He began to note the surroundings more carefully, the pattern of cracks around it, the angle of the cliff, the way the ledge beneath it dipped suddenly into open air. Once he noticed something that made his skin prickle, a short length of rusted wire protruding from a crevice not far from the window, bent as if it had once been a part of something larger. It was not the sort of thing the mountain produced on its own. He mentioned the window once, only once in the village. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. A man he knew stiffened, eyes darting away as if he had heard something dangerous and said it was probably nothing, that the mountains played tricks on people. A woman changed the subject so abruptly that the words collided in her mouth. He felt something close around the topic, an invisible hand pushing it back into silence, and he understood that whatever he had found was not merely a curiosity. It was a secret, and secrets in a place like this were rarely harmless. He stopped talking about it then, but he did not stop thinking. The rectangle in the rock had become an anchor for his thoughts, a fixed point in a life that otherwise felt like drifting. He did not yet know what it was, did not yet dare to believe what it might be, but he felt with growing certainty that it was not meant to be seen, that someone had worked very hard to hide it in plain sight, trusting that the mountain itself would protect it from discovery. The rectangle in the cliff did not leave him alone. It followed him down the mountain into the village, lingered in the corners of his dim kitchen, hovered in the pale steam that rose from his kettle each morning. He began to time his days by it, not by the stove or the market schedule or the trader's arrival, but by the angle of the sun on the rock face where that impossible window waited. The habit was not conscious at first. He would find himself halfway through a chore and suddenly realize he had turned his head toward the mountains, as if his body were trying to realign itself with something that only it could sense. The first morning he returned after his brief attempt to speak of it in the village, he did so with a peculiar caution, like someone approaching a sleeping animal that might wake and strike. The path was familiar, yet he felt every stone beneath his boots, every brittle stem of grass that snapped in the cold. When he reached the overlook, he paused before lifting his eyes, giving himself a moment to remember the shape of the rock as it had always been. Only then did he look, and the window was there, unchanged, indifferent to his anxiety. It was not large. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for a shallow niche or a slab of lighter stone, but as he focused on it, the geometry asserted itself with quiet insistence. The edges were too straight, the proportions too deliberate. He noticed now what he had not the first time, that the surface within the frame was not matte like rock, but held a faint sheen, as if polished or coated. When the sun slid low, that sheen caught it and sent a muted reflection back toward him. Not bright enough to dazzle, but bright enough to say that something smooth lay behind the mountain's rough skin. He came again the next day, and the next, each time shifting his position by a few steps, then a few more, trying to find an angle that would let him see past the glare. At one point, he crouched and peered upward, squinting until his eyes watered, and thought he saw darkness behind the pale surface, a depth that stone alone could not contain. That night, he could not sleep at all. The wind rattled his patched windows, and the stove smoked despite his careful tending, and through it all the thought persisted that there was a room somewhere inside the cliff waiting. As his visits multiplied, he began to notice things he had overlooked in his years of wandering these slopes. There was a subtle pattern of wear on the rock beneath the window, a place where rain and melting snow had carved a faint channel, not downwards but sideways, as if guided by something unseen. There were marks that might have been natural fractures, but they formed a loose sequence that led the eye toward a narrow seam in the stone a short distance away. He pressed his fingers into that seam and felt cold air stir against his skin, not enough to be a breeze, but enough to unsettle him. The wire he had spotted earlier became another point of fixation. He pried it free one afternoon and turned it in his hands. It was not random debris. It was the remnant of a fastener, twisted at one end into a crude loop, corroded but stubbornly intact. Someone had used it here. Someone had stood on this mountain face and left behind a piece of their intention. He did not speak of it again in the village, yet the knowledge that others recoiled from the subject only deepened his resolve. He began to feel that the mountain was offering him a choice. He could turn away, pretend he had never seen the rectangle, go back to hauling rusted rails and patching his walls, or he could accept that he had been placed in the path of something that would not let him go until he understood it. The seam in the rock became his next obsession. It ran no more than a few meters, narrow enough to be invisible from a distance, but when he traced it with his eyes, he saw that it led not straight to the window, but obliquely, toward a part of the cliff where the face broke into a shallow ledge. The ledge itself was not wide, barely the length of his boot, and below it the rock dropped away into open air. He tested the first step with the tip of his foot and felt his stomach tighten. The mountain had always been unforgiving, but this was different. This was not a place where he could afford to misjudge even once. He retreated that day with his heart pounding, not from fear alone, but from a growing conviction that he had found the path, however treacherous it might be. At home, he packed and unpacked his rucksack repeatedly, not yet daring to attempt the crossing, but preparing himself all the same. He checked the condition of his rope, frayed from years of use, and cut away the worst strands. He found his old gloves, the leather stiff but serviceable, and set them near the stove to soften. He began to ration his food, not because he was poorer than usual, but because some part of him anticipated a time when he might not return before nightfall. The pressure of secrecy weighed on him. Each time someone asked where he had been, he answered vaguely, gesturing toward the hills as if that explained everything. He could feel eyes on him more often now, or perhaps he only imagined them, his nerves sharpened by the knowledge that he carried something inside him that did not belong to the rest of the village. The rectangle in the cliff was no longer merely a curiosity. It had become a boundary between the life he had always known and a life he had not yet dared to imagine. On the 7th day after his first sighting, he returned to the overlook with a decision that settled into him as solidly as the mountain beneath his feet. He would try. He would follow the seam, take the narrow ledge, and see what lay behind the pale surface that had haunted his sleep. The sun was already lowering, throwing long shadows across the valley, and the cold had begun to creep up from the ravine below. He stood for a moment, breathing the thin air, letting the rhythm of the place steady him. Then he turned toward the seam and took his first step away from the path he had always known. He moved along the seam in the rock with the care of someone who had already accepted that the mountain would not forgive a mistake. The ledge was no more than a thought, a slight interruption in the vertical plane of the cliff, and he kept his weight low, one shoulder pressed against the cold stone, fingertips searching for imperfections that might hold him. Below him, the valley opened in a dizzying drop, the village reduced to a scatter of dark shapes in a pale basin, and for a moment he had to close his eyes to keep the world from tilting. The rope hung coiled at his side, more a promise than a guarantee, and he fixed it around a protruding block of stone that might have been solid or might have been waiting for exactly this pressure to break free. The gloves, softened by the stove, now gripped the rock with a dull rasping sound that seemed loud enough to echo across the mountains. He slid his foot sideways, felt the edge of the ledge with the inside of his boot, then committed his weight to it and breathed again only when nothing shifted beneath him. The seam led him not directly to the rectangle, but toward a shallow recess where the cliff curved inward, offering just enough shelter to pause. From there he could see the window clearly, no longer a distant curiosity but a concrete presence set into the mountain's flesh. The frame was metal, he realized now, not stone at all, corroded to the same gray as the surrounding rock but still unmistakably artificial. The glass within it was thick, clouded by decades of exposure, yet unbroken. He crossed the last stretch of open rock in a blur of movement he could not later remember, as if his body had taken over while his mind hovered somewhere behind him, cataloging the danger without quite inhabiting it. When his hands finally closed around the edge of the frame, he felt a jolt of disbelief so strong that it nearly made him laugh. He was touching something that should not exist here, a manufactured object in a place where only wind and frost had any right to shape the world. Up close, the window told a story the mountain had tried to erase. The metal was pitted, eaten away by time, but the bolts that held it in place were still visible, their heads half buried in mineral deposits. Someone had not merely cut a hole in the cliff, someone had built into it, anchoring the frame with an engineer's precision. He pressed his face near the glass and wiped at it with his sleeve until the faint film of grime thinned enough to let him see. At first, there was only darkness beyond the pane, a depth that swallowed the weak light of the late afternoon. Then, as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. A wall not of raw stone, but of smooth boards, a shelf, the corner of a table. The air on the other side was not dead. It carried a faint current, a warmth so subtle he would have missed it had he not been desperate for any sign that he was not about to find a tomb. He tested the window, pressing against it gently, then with more force. It did not budge. For a terrible moment he thought that this was all he would ever have, the sight of a hidden room sealed beyond his reach. Then his fingers brushed against something at the lower edge of the frame, a notch where corrosion had exposed a mechanism the mountain had not quite consumed. He scraped away grit with his knife, working slowly, afraid that one careless movement would shatter the glass or send him tumbling into the void. The latch resisted him, its metal stiff with rust, but when it finally shifted, the sound was a muted click that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He pulled the window inward. It opened, not with a swing, but with a grudging slide, the seal, breaking after decades, with a breath of air that smelled of dust and old wood rather than damp stone. He had expected cold. Instead, he felt a whisper of warmth brush his cheek. Climbing through was awkward, a contortion of limbs and fear, his pack snagging on the frame, his boots scraping against the inner sill. He dropped onto the floor on the other side with a thud that sent a puff of dust into the air, then froze, half expecting some alarm to sound or the ceiling to collapse. Nothing happened. The room held. It was small, barely larger than his kitchen at home, but it was a room, not a cavity. The walls were paneled in dark wood, dry and intact, the floor covered with a thin layer of grit that shifted under his boots. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its mattress long since disintegrated, the springs beneath it coated in rust. A table occupied the center, its surface bare except for the shadow of something that had been removed. There was no sign of water damage, no mold creeping along the corners. Whoever had built this place had known how to keep the mountain at bay. He turned slowly, taking it in, and only then noticed the doorway at the far end, a rectangular opening leading into darkness. The air flowing from it was warmer than the air in the room, carrying a faint metallic tang that suggested machinery, or perhaps fuel. He moved toward it with the same care he had used on the ledge, though here the danger was not gravity, but the unknown. The corridor beyond sloped gently downward, its walls reinforced with beams set into the rock. Wires ran along the ceiling, bundled neatly, disappearing into the gloom. He followed them until the narrow beam of his flashlight picked out a junction box, its cover still in place. He touched it and felt not cold, but the neutral temperature of something insulated, protected from the mountain's relentless chill. A sense of scale began to dawn on him then. This was not a shelter hacked out in desperation, not a cave someone had stumbled upon and decided to occupy. This was a structure, planned and executed by someone who had understood both stone and steel. The mountain had not simply been pierced, it had been persuaded. He stood there, halfway between the world he had always known and the hidden world opening before him, and felt the weight of that realization settle over him. The rectangle in the cliff was no longer a mystery in the abstract. It was an entrance, and he had crossed it. Whatever lay ahead was not a rumor or a trick of light. It was a place that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to find it. The corridor drew him inward with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with design. It was not a tunnel in the crude sense, a wound in the mountain hacked out in haste, but a passage that had been measured, reinforced, and finished with care. The beams that framed it were old but unrotted, their surfaces darkened by age yet free of the telltale bloom of fungus. He ran his fingers along one as he walked and felt the faint ridges of a carpenter's plane still present beneath the dust, as if the wood remembered the hands that had shaped it. The air was different here. It held a steady temperature, neither warm nor cold, a narrow band of comfort that stood in defiance of the brutal seasons outside. Each step carried him deeper into a world that should not have existed, and yet, with every meter it became more real. The corridor opened into a wider space that made him stop short, his breath catching not with fear, but with disbelief. Before him lay a kitchen, not a parody of one, but a true room with counters, shelves, a sink set into a slab of stone, and a stove that was not the simple iron box he knew at home, but a complex assembly of pipes and vents leading upward into the rock. He walked in slowly, as if afraid that the floor might vanish if he moved too quickly. The cabinets were closed, their handles dulled by time but still intact. When he opened one, he found stacks of plates wrapped in yellowed cloth, cups arranged by size, cutlery laid out in careful rows. Nothing had been disturbed since the day it was placed there. The dust lay like a veil over everything, thick enough to write in, yet beneath it the order of a working life remained. Beyond the kitchen a door led into a small bedroom, the bed neatly made despite the mattress having collapsed into itself, a wardrobe standing against the far wall. He opened it and found clothing folded and hung, garments that spoke of a man who had once walked in the open world, who had dressed for cold mornings and long days underground. The smell of old fabric drifted out, not unpleasant, only tinged with the dry sweetness of time. The next room was a workspace, and here the purpose of the place sharpened into focus. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with books whose spines were cracked but legible, their titles speaking of geology, structural engineering, the physics of rock stress and collapse. A desk stood beneath a lamp that had been designed not to be plugged into a wall, but wired directly into the ceiling, and on that desk lay a scattering of papers that had not been reduced to pulp by moisture or neglect. He picked one up and saw hand-drawn diagrams of mountain profiles, layers of stone traced with a precision he recognized from the mine plans he had glimpsed as a boy. He followed the corridor again and found a narrow stair descending into the mountain's core. The steps were metal, bolted into the stone, each one still firm beneath his weight. At the bottom, he entered a room that made him forget for a moment to be careful. It was a technical space, a heart hidden inside the rock, dominated by a generator unlike anything he had seen outside of photographs. It was not a factory model hauled in by truck, but a construction assembled piece by piece, a hybrid of scavenged parts and bespoke solutions. Pipes ran from it into the walls, and he traced one to a set of tanks tucked into a side alcove, their surfaces beaded with condensation. He unscrewed a cap and peered inside, shining his flashlight down into darkness that reflected back not black, but a pale shimmer. Water. Clean, stored water, protected from the outside world. The revelation shook him. He had expected remnants, maybe a half-collapsed hole with a few tools left behind. What he found instead was a system, an ecosystem designed to keep a person alive in isolation for months, perhaps years. There were racks of jars and tins in the adjacent storage room, most empty now, but some still sealed, their labels faded beyond recognition. There were coils of cable, boxes of spare parts, even a manual bound in leather that described, in a tight, disciplined hand, the maintenance procedures for the generator and the ventilation system. He returned to the workspace and sat in the chair before the desk, the wood creaking under his weight. The feeling that came over him then was not triumph, but unease. A place like this was not built on a whim. It was a result of long planning, of labor carried out in secrecy, of a need so great that someone had been willing to carve a home into a mountain rather than face whatever lay beyond it. He leafed through the papers on the desk and found the first hints of a story. Dates, carefully noted, references to shafts and tunnels he recognized from the abandoned mine above the village. Marginal notes about load limits, about signs of instability that had been ignored. There was anger in the handwriting, a pressure that deepened where certain names appeared, as if the pen itself had pressed harder in response. The deeper he went, the more the sense of sudden abandonment troubled him. In the kitchen, a pot still sat on the stove, its lid askew, as though it had been left mid-task. In the bedroom, a book lay open on the bedside table, its pages frozen in the act of being read. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no chaos, no scattered possessions. Whoever had lived here had not fled in panic. They had simply gone, leaving behind a life that had been constructed to endure. The last door he tried was locked, its handle refusing to turn. It was no different in appearance from the others, yet it radiated a kind of significance he could not explain. He placed his palm against it and felt nothing but cool wood, but something in him tightened, a premonition that whatever lay beyond it was the reason this hidden house existed at all. He did not force it then. He had crossed one boundary already. He sensed that this next one would not be so easily undone. The locked door would not leave him alone. It was not merely a physical barrier, but a weight that settled in his thoughts the moment he climbed back out through the window and retraced the perilous ledge to solid ground. For days afterward, he moved through the village as if part of him were still standing in front of that stubborn handle, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm, wondering what could be important enough to merit such deliberate separation from the rest of the house. He returned to the mountain as soon as he dared, carrying tools he had not brought the first time, a small pry bar, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and the uneasy certainty that whatever lay behind that door had the power to change his understanding of the place entirely. The journey along the seam was no less frightening for being familiar. Each time he slid his foot along the ledge, he felt the old fear rise, not dulled but refined into a sharper awareness of his own fragility. Yet, when he climbed through the window and stood once more in the small outer room, he felt something like relief, as though he had crossed from a hostile world into one that, however strange, had been made for a human body. He approached the locked door with a care that bordered on reverence. The wood was dry, its surface worn smooth by hands that had opened and closed it many times, and the lock itself was not a crude padlock, but a built-in mechanism that had been integrated into the frame. He examined it closely, tracing the outline with his knife until he found a seam where the paneling shifted slightly. It took time, sweat, and a patience he did not know he possessed. But at last the pressure of the pry bar coaxed a hidden latch to release, and the door opened with a sigh that seemed almost human. The room beyond was smaller than he had expected, yet more densely packed than any other in the house. Shelves lined every wall, and they were not empty. Boxes were stacked with a precision that spoke of obsessive order, each one labeled in a hand that had already begun to feel familiar to him. He lifted the lid of the nearest box and found folders inside, thick with paper, their edges curled but not crumbling. When he opened the first folder, the air seemed to thicken around him as if the room itself were holding its breath. There were photographs, not glossy prints but matte images developed in the careful darkness of a home lab. They showed the inside of the mine as he remembered it from his childhood, the rough-hewn walls, the dim lights strung along tunnels, the men standing with their helmets tilted back, eyes reflecting the flash. Then the images changed. New supports appeared, thinner than the old ones, set too far apart. Cracks were circled in red ink. In one photograph, a section of ceiling bulged downward like the belly of a beast about to tear itself free. He sank down onto the floor with the folder still open in his hands and continued to turn the pages. There were maps here, too, hand-drawn, tracing the network of shafts beneath the mountain, annotated with notes that grew more urgent as the years progressed. Dates were scrawled in the margins, some underlined, others crossed out, and he began to recognize a pattern in them. The handwriting changed subtly over time, the lines growing tighter, the letters sharper, as though the man who had made these records had been fighting against a pressure that came not only from the rock overhead, but from something inside himself. He opened another box and found journals, their covers worn smooth, the pages inside dense with text. He did not read them all at once. Instead, he flipped through them, letting fragments leap out at him, mentions of inspections that never happened, of reports altered before submission, of meetings where concerns were dismissed with a wave of a hand and a promise of profit. Then came the entry that made his throat close. It described the day of the collapse, not in technical terms but in the raw language of loss. Names filled the page, some underlined, some followed by brief notes that could only be the record of a mind struggling to hold on to too much grief. He learned then that the man who had built this hidden house had been an engineer, not a drifter or a recluse, but someone who had once stood at the center of the village's industry. He had lost his family in the disaster, lost them in a way that had left no body to bury, only an absence that could not be filled. The journals traced his descent into isolation, not as an escape from the world, but as a campaign against it. He had returned to the mountain, not to hide from it, but to watch it, to study its wounds and the lies told about them. In the back of the room, he found a shelf set apart from the rest, its boxes smaller, their labels more cryptic. Inside were not papers but samples, small chunks of rock sealed in plastic, each tagged with a code that corresponded to notes in a ledger. He cross-referenced one and found a meticulous analysis of the mineral composition, a demonstration that the supports installed in certain sections of the mine had been doomed to fail from the start. The man had not merely suspected wrongdoing, he had proven it. The deeper he delved into the archive, the more he saw the outline of a system that had been built on silence. There were letters here, unsent drafts that named officials and owners, that detailed a chain of decisions stretching far beyond the village. He recognized some of the surnames. They were the same ones that still appeared on signs and documents, the same families whose representatives now walked the village promising renewal. By the time he closed the last box, his legs had gone numb, and the light from his flashlight trembled in his grip. He understood now why the door had been locked, why the house had been designed to vanish into the mountain. This was not a refuge alone. It was a vault, a repository of truths that had been too dangerous to expose in the open world. The engineer had not been hiding. He had been waiting. When he left the room at last, he did so with a sense of solemnity he had never felt before. He locked the door behind him not to keep himself out, but to honor the intent that had created it. Outside, as he edged back along the ledge and let the cold mountain air wash over him, he carried more than the memory of what he had seen. He carried the knowledge that the rectangle in the cliff was not an accident of stone, but a witness, and that by finding it he had inherited a responsibility he could no longer pretend did not exist. The responsibility he carried out of the mountain that evening was heavier than any scrap metal he had ever dragged down its slopes. It bent his posture and narrowed his thoughts until even the familiar path back to the village felt strange beneath his feet. He did not go home right away. Instead, he circled wide through the trees, forcing himself to slow down, to breathe, to let the fear and the exhilaration settle into something he could live with. Only when the last light had faded from the peaks did he unlock his door and slip inside, carrying with him the certainty that his life had quietly pivoted around a point he could no longer see. He returned to the hidden house the next morning with the practical resolve of a man who knows that revelation alone is useless without action. The locked archive room remained untouched, but the rest of the place began to change under his hands. He swept the dust from the kitchen floor, wiped down the counters, and opened the cabinets one by one, assessing what remained and what had been lost to time. Most of the food was long gone, yet the jars and tins themselves were valuable, containers waiting to be filled. He carried in water in small bottles at first, careful not to draw attention to his trips, then gradually in larger canisters that he cached among the rocks until he could move them inside in the dark. The generator became his next project. He approached it with the same respect he had felt for the archive, reading the leather-bound manual until he understood not just how to start it, but how to coax it into long life. The man who had built it had been thorough, leaving notes in the margins that read less like instructions and more like conversations with himself, warnings about specific parts, reminders to listen for certain vibrations. It took him 2 days of careful work to restore the fuel lines and clean the intake, and when he finally turned the switch, he did so with his heart pounding, half expecting the machine to seize or explode. Instead, it responded with a low, steady hum that filled the room with a vibration so gentle he could feel it through the soles of his boots. That sound changed the way he perceived the mountain. The house was no longer a static relic. It was alive again, breathing through its vents, sending power along wires that had waited decades for this moment. He replaced broken bulbs, watching as soft light spread through corridors that had known only darkness since the engineer's disappearance. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom and let himself imagine what it would be like to sleep here, wrapped in warmth while storms raged unseen outside. At home in the village, he became more careful. He rationed his words as he rationed his food, keeping his movements predictable, his habits unchanged. When he carried supplies, he did so in pieces small enough to be overlooked. A sack of flour here, a bundle of firewood there, items no one would question. The house in the mountain grew more habitable by inches rather than leaps, a quiet transformation invisible to anyone but him. Yet the archive did not leave him alone. At night, he dreamed of pages filled with names, of photographs that shifted and blurred before he could fix them in his mind. He began to copy sections of the journals by hand, not trusting himself to remove the originals, yet unwilling to leave their contents entirely sealed away. Sitting at the kitchen table in his own house, he wrote until his fingers cramped, the words forming a bridge between the world he had always known and the hidden truth embedded in the mountain. The pressure in the village increased as winter tightened its grip. A representative of the investment company arrived one afternoon in a clean vehicle that looked absurd among the rutted tracks of the main road. Promises were made in the square, voices raised just enough to carry, about jobs, about progress, about a future that would not look like the past. Some people listened with folded arms, suspicion etched into their faces, while others leaned forward, hungry for anything that might rescue them from the slow decay of the place. He stood at the edge of the gathering and said nothing, but the words in the archive flared in his mind like warning lights. After that, small things began to change around him. A neighbor asked more pointed questions about his plans. Someone mentioned in passing that his property lay in a convenient location should certain developments proceed. None of it was overt, none of it enough to confront, but taken together it formed a pattern he recognized from the engineer's journals. The pressure was building again, subtle and relentless, and he knew now how that story could end. The house in the mountain became not just a refuge, but a base of operations. He organized the archive into piles that made sense to him, separating evidence that spoke of technical failures from documents that traced responsibility. He taught himself to read the maps properly, to follow the lines of stress and fracture that the engineer had so painstakingly marked. Each new understanding tightened the knot in his chest. This was not history. This was the present. Wearing a different coat, he began to think in terms of exposure. The man who had built the house had gathered the truth, but had never found a way to release it. Whether fear or exhaustion or simple bad luck had silenced him, the result was the same. The mountain had kept its secret, and the village had been left to repeat its mistakes. That cycle would not break itself. It would require someone to step into the open with more than suspicions and memories. He did not yet know how he would do it. He only knew that he could not afford to wait much longer. The generator hummed in the depths of the cliff, the vents carried warmth through hidden channels, and in a locked room behind a door that had been opened at last, the truth waited in orderly boxes. Above ground, the village held its breath, and he felt, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that the narrow space between those two worlds was now his to cross. The narrow space between the hidden house and the village began to feel like the only place where he truly existed. Each morning he woke with the same quiet urgency pressing against his ribs, the knowledge that what lay sealed behind the locked door in the mountain could not remain there much longer. The generator's low murmur had become a kind of heartbeat in his mind, a reminder that the house was alive again, and that he was, in a way, its steward. But stewardship alone would not save anyone. The truth had to leave the rock. He worked with the archive methodically, choosing documents not for their drama, but for their inevitability. The journals were powerful, but they were personal, and personal stories could be dismissed as grief made articulate. What could not be dismissed were the technical records, the maps marked with failure points, the test results that showed how cheaply substituted materials would behave under pressure. He copied these by hand at first, then learned to photograph them under the harsh light of the generator-powered lamp, angling the pages to minimize shadow, labeling each image so that the chain of evidence would not dissolve into a blur of numbers and sketches. The problem was not gathering the truth, it was moving it. The village had only sporadic internet access, and anything uploaded from there would be slow, conspicuous, easy to trace. He needed someone outside, someone who could receive the files and decide what to do with them without drawing a line back to him. The engineer's journals mentioned a former miner who had left years ago after arguing with management, a man who had been loud about safety and who had vanished from the village in the same season the hidden house was first completed. It took him days to locate a number through the brittle web of contacts that still linked the scattered remnants of the community, and even then he hesitated before making the call, the phone heavy in his hand. He did not speak of the mountain. He spoke of history, of documents that had come into his possession, of a story that had never been told. The voice on the other end went quiet, then asked questions that told him he had reached the right person. They agreed on a method that would leave no obvious trail, and when he ended the call he felt the peculiar mixture of relief and dread that follows the crossing of a line that cannot be uncrossed. The transfer took place over several nights, each session short enough to avoid notice, each one accompanied by a tightening in his stomach as the progress bar crept forward. He did not watch it complete. He turned away, pacing the small kitchen of the hidden house, listening to the generator, counting his breaths until the machine finished its work. Only then did he allow himself to look, to confirm that the files had been sent and that the archive had, at last, found a path out of the mountain. Almost immediately, the atmosphere in the village shifted. It was subtle at first, a sense of acceleration, of conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room, of cars that did not belong here passing through more often. The investment company's representative became a regular presence, his polished boots a jarring contrast against the mud of the square. Meetings were announced with little notice, attendance framed as an opportunity rather than a requirement, yet the undertone was unmistakable. Decisions were being made, and they were not waiting for everyone to catch up. He felt the pressure gather around him like a weather front. A neighbor remarked casually that someone had been asking about his habits, about the paths he favored in the hills. Another mentioned that the company had expressed interest in consolidating properties along the slope above the old mine road, a phrase that hung in the air long after it was spoken. He began to vary his routes, leaving his house at different times, returning after dark or before dawn, careful not to create a pattern that could be followed. The mountain, once his refuge, became a field of maneuver. He learned new approaches to the ledge, paths that looped back on themselves, tracks that vanished into rock and brush. He stored supplies in multiple caches rather than carrying everything at once, reducing the risk that anyone who chanced upon him would see more than a man on his way to gather firewood. The house inside the cliff absorbed these changes with its quiet indifference, the generator humming, the archive waiting, the locked door holding back a history that was no longer entirely under his control. Then came the near discovery. He had climbed late one afternoon, the light already thinning, when he heard voices below him, closer to the seam than anyone had ever been before. He pressed himself into a shallow indentation in the rock and waited, the cold biting through his jacket, while two men moved along the slope beneath him, pointing, speaking in low tones. They did not look up, but their presence there at all felt like a finger tracing the outline of his secret. He remained motionless long after they had gone, until the last echo of their boots had faded into the valley. That night, he did not sleep in the village. He stayed in the hidden house, sitting in the archive room with the door locked, sorting through documents he had already copied, selecting a second set to conceal elsewhere in case the first trail was severed. The engineer had not trusted any single safeguard, and now he understood why. He wrapped the most critical pages in plastic, sealed them inside a metal box, and hid it in a niche he had discovered behind the water tanks, a place no one would think to search unless they already knew what they were looking for. Outside, the storm he had felt gathering finally broke. The first public hint of the story appeared not in the village but in a distant news feed, a brief mention of historical irregularities in mining safety records, a promise of a deeper investigation to come. The investment company's representative vanished from the square the next day, replaced by men in heavier coats who asked more precise questions. He watched them from a distance, feeling the truth he had sent out into the world ripple back toward him like a wave he could no longer outrun. By the time he climbed into the mountain again, heart pounding, boots slick with melting snow, he knew that the hidden house was no longer merely a shelter. It was a battleground, and he was no longer the only one who sensed its importance. The wave he had unleashed did not crash all at once. It rolled outward from the village in widening circles, gathering weight as it went, until even those who had tried for years to bury the past found themselves standing in its path. At first, it was only whispers on distant channels, cautious language wrapped around old dates and half-forgotten accidents. But within days, the tone sharpened. Investigative pieces appeared that no longer treated the mine collapse as an unfortunate relic of a less regulated era, but as the visible wound of a deeper corruption. Names he had seen in the archive were printed again, no longer as benevolent benefactors or civic leaders, but as participants in a story that demanded reckoning. In the village, the effect was immediate and disorienting. People gathered in small clusters that dissolved when approached, their faces carrying a blend of vindication and fear. For some, the articles were a revelation, an explanation for grief they had never been allowed to articulate. For others, they were a threat, the shattering of a fragile hope that the return of industry might rescue them from the slow death of isolation. The representative from the investment company did not come back, and the men in heavy coats who had replaced him changed their demeanor overnight, no longer promising opportunity but asking questions that sounded like they had been prepared by lawyers rather than planners. He watched these changes from the margins, careful not to draw attention to himself. The pressure that had gathered around him did not vanish, but it shifted, redirected towards the faceless machinery of investigations and committees that now took an interest in the valley. The project to reopen the mine was announced as postponed pending review, then quietly suspended, then finally declared unviable. Each statement was couched in neutral language, but the meaning was unmistakable. The mountain would not be cut open again, at least not in the way it once had been. The reckoning did not end there. Old contracts were re-examined, dormant files pulled from archives that had not been opened in decades. A former inspector was called to account for reports he had signed long ago. A shareholder issued a statement of regret that contained more caution than sorrow. These were small victories, perhaps, but they accumulated, forming a narrative that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or personal vendetta. The engineer's work, hidden for so long in the rock, had finally found a voice. In the village, the shift in mood was palpable. The names of the dead were spoken aloud again, not as a list carved into stone, but as individual lives remembered in kitchens and over fences. Stories emerged that had been kept locked away, tales of warnings ignored, of men sent back underground despite the sound of the mountain settling around them. The silence that had haunted the place for years fractured, and in the cracks something like honesty began to grow. He felt the change in smaller ways, too. People no longer looked away when he passed. A few nodded. Some even stopped to speak, not to ask for details he could not give, but to acknowledge that something had happened, something that had altered the shape of their shared world. He did not claim credit. He could not. The house in the mountain was not his to reveal, and the story belonged as much to the engineer who had built it as to anyone who had suffered the consequences of the lies it documented. The hidden house itself became his anchor in the weeks that followed. He returned to it, not in haste or fear, but with a steadier purpose, carrying fewer supplies now that he no longer needed to live there in constant readiness for flight. He sorted the archive one last time, separating what had already entered the public domain from what remained his final safeguard. The locked door stayed locked, not because he feared discovery, but because the room had fulfilled its purpose. The mountain had kept its secret until the world was ready to hear it. He considered what would become of the place. There was a temptation to turn it into a symbol, to invite officials or journalists to stand in the narrow room behind the window and marvel at the ingenuity that had preserved a truth the open air could not. But he knew that spectacle would devour it. The house was not a monument. It was a refuge born of necessity, a response to a failure that should never be repeated. He decided instead to let it remain what it had always been, a quiet witness embedded in stone. In time, the investigations moved on, as investigations do, toward other stories in other valleys. The village did not become prosperous overnight. Shops did not reopen, and the winters remained long and unforgiving. Yet, something essential had shifted. The mountain no longer loomed as an accomplice to silence. It was simply a mountain again, heavy with memory, but no longer carrying the burden of unspoken truth. On a clear morning, near the end of the season, he climbed to the ledge and stood in the small room behind the window, looking out at the valley through glass that had once reflected only his own curiosity. The light now fell differently. It was not the pale, tentative gleam that had first drawn his eye, but a fuller illumination that reached into the corners of the room and softened the edges of the furniture left behind. He thought of the engineer, of the long years of work that had gone into building a life inside a cliff, and felt a kinship that did not require words. He closed the window gently when he left, sealing the house once more within the mountain, and began the careful descent toward the world below. The path was still narrow, the ledge still unforgiving, but he walked it with a steadiness he had never known before. The rectangle in the rock was no longer a mystery to him. It was an entrance that had led him into the past, and in doing so, had opened a door he could not have found anywhere else. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't stop here. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the next discovery. More hidden places, more secrets, more unbelievable stories are already waiting for you in our other videos. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.